A man worth $10 billion stands in line for 20 minutes, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn-out coat, waiting for a simple cup of coffee. He's surrounded by construction workers on their break and students nursing their laptops, and not a single person gives him a second glance. He could buy the entire city block without checking his bank balance, yet he waits. He waits like everyone else. But he's not here for the coffee. He's hunting a ghost from his past. And in a few moments, the waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that reads, Olivia, will not see a billionaire. She'll see a monster from her childhood and expose a truth that has been buried under decades of money guilt and lies. The rain fell on the streets of Portland, Oregon, with a relentless, dreary persistence. It was the kind of Tuesday afternoon that made people huddle deeper into their coats and hurry from one dry place to the next. Inside the Corner Spoon, the air was thick with the comforting trinity of diner smells: old coffee, frying bacon, and damp wool. The diner was an institution, a relic from a time before minimalist cafes and artisanal toast. Its vinyl booths were cracked like old leather. The linoleum floor was a mosaic of scuffs and stories, and the lighting hummed with a warm, yellowed glow. And in the line that snaked from the cash register to the door, a man stood with a patience that seemed out of place. He was unassuming, perhaps in his late 30s, with a face that was neither handsome nor plain, but etched with a quiet intensity. His dark hair was cut short, his jawline shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. He wore simple jeans, worn leather boots, and a grey peacoat that had seen better days. Nothing about him screamed wealth. Nothing except perhaps the watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe Grand. Complications, a subtle masterpiece of engineering worth more than the diner itself. But he wore it with the face turned inward, a habit he'd developed to avoid unwanted attention. His name was Ethan Cartwright, and his net worth was a number so large it had become an abstraction. As the CEO of Helios Dynamics, a pioneer in renewable energy and data storage, he was a titan of modern industry. His face had graced the cover of Forbes and Wired. His decisions moved markets. Yet here he was, sixth in line, listening to the clatter of plates and the low murmur of conversations, feeling the gnawing anxiety that had been his constant companion for 20 years. He wasn't here for a publicity stunt or a back to the common man photo op. His security detail was parked 2 blocks away in an unremarkable sedan under strict orders not to intervene unless he signaled a clear and present danger. Ethan was on a personal pilgrimage, a desperate last-ditch effort to find a phantom. For 6 months, his private investigators had been chasing whispers, following cold trails that all led to this part of the city, to this specific neighborhood. The trail always ended here, in the anonymous working-class heart of the city he had once called home. Next, a voice called out, tired but firm. Ethan shuffled forward. The line was a microcosm of the city, a tired-looking nurse ending her shift, 2 construction workers arguing about football, a college student with headphones clamped over her ears. They were all wrapped in their own worlds, their own struggles and small triumphs. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt profoundly, achingly normal. In his world of boardrooms and chartered jets, he was a symbol, an entity. Here he was, just a guy waiting for a table. After what felt like an eternity, the hostess, a young woman with pink hair and a bored expression, gestured vaguely towards the back. Booth in the corner is free. Olivia will be with you in a minute. Ethan nodded, his heart thumping a strange, nervous rhythm against his ribs. He slid into the booth, the cracked vinyl cool against his back. He placed his hands on the worn Formica tabletop, tracing the faint scratches with his thumb. From this vantage point, he could see the whole diner. He watched the cooks moving with practiced efficiency. Behind the counter, the steam rising from the grill, the rhythmic dance of the waitstaff. And then he saw her. She moved between tables with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and years of practice. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, a few stray strands clinging to her temples. Her uniform, a simple black polo shirt and apron, was clean but faded. She looked tired. There were faint lines around her eyes that shouldn't have been there on a woman who couldn't be much older than he was. Her name tag, pinned neatly to her shirt, read, Olivia. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't unkind. She took an order from a family with 2 noisy children, her expression patient, her movements swift. She refilled coffee cups, cleared plates, and navigated the cramped space with a grace born of necessity. Ethan watched her, his breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. Could it? 20 years was a long time. Faces changed. People became ghosts of who they once were. He had been chasing a name, a ghost. But seeing her in the flesh, it was different. He had to be sure. He had to know. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, and waited for her to approach. The fate of his entire quest, the hope for an absolution he craved more than any business deal, rested on the next few minutes. It all came down to a weary waitress in a corner diner on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Olivia Chen felt the man's eyes on her long before she reached his table. It wasn't an uncommon feeling in her line of work. Sometimes it was a customer impatient for a refill. Sometimes it was an unwelcome, lingering stare. But this was different. This felt heavy, like she was being studied, not just watched. She grabbed a menu, a glass of water, and a handful of silverware wrapped in a paper napkin, and made her way to the corner booth. "Sorry for the wait," she said, her voice a practiced, neutral tone. She placed the items on the table without looking up her mind already on the 3 other tables in her section. "What can I get started for you?" "Coffee," the man said. His voice was quiet, deeper than she expected. "Black." "Just coffee for now," she asked, finally meeting his gaze. His eyes were a deep, searching grey. There was something unsettling in them, a strange mix of hope and fear. For a split second, a jolt of familiarity, faint and electric, ran through her. She mentally shook her head. She saw hundreds of faces a week. They all started to blur together. "Yes," for now he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. She gave a curt nod and turned away, heading for the coffee station. The feeling lingered. It was like trying to remember the name of a song you'd only heard once, years ago. A phantom on the edge of memory. She poured the coffee, the dark, steaming liquid filling the thick ceramic mug. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, a man whose personality was as bland as his beige tie, was barking at one of the new busboys. The familiar chaos of the lunch rush was a comforting noise, and she pushed the strange feeling aside. Returning to the corner booth, she placed the mug on the table. "Here you go. Thank you." "Olivia," he said, reading her name tag. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug. As his sleeve pulled back, a pale, jagged scar was visible on the inside of his right wrist. It was an old wound, silvery white, against his skin, shaped almost like a crude lightning bolt. Olivia's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand holding the coffee pot froze mid-air. The scar. The world around her seemed to dissolve. The clatter of the diner faded into a dull roar. The smell of coffee was replaced by the phantom scent of smoke and burnt wood. Suddenly, she wasn't a 37-year-old waitress in Portland. She was a 17-year-old girl standing in the charred ruins of a gymnasium, her lungs aching, her eyes streaming. She saw a boy's face smudged with soot, his grey eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. She saw him clutching his wrist where a shard of falling fiery debris had sliced him open. She remembered the promise he'd made, his voice raw with desperation, just before the paramedics had pulled them apart. "I'll find you and Daniel." He'd gasped. "I promise. No matter what." The coffee pot trembled in her hand. A few hot drops splashed onto the table, sizzling faintly. The man in the booth looked up at his expression of quiet observation, instantly replaced with one of alarm. "Are you all right?" Olivia stared at him. Really stared at him for the first time. She looked past the expensive watch he tried to hide, past the subtle signs of a life of comfort and success. She saw the boy. The jawline was stronger, the face was older, lined with a different kind of worry, but the eyes were the same. The same stormy grey, the same haunted intensity. Ethan. The name was a whisper, a ghost on her lips. It was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 2 decades, a name she had buried under layers of resentment, anger, and a grief so profound it had reshaped her entire life. The man's face went pale. The quiet facade he had so carefully constructed crumbled into 1,000,000 pieces. The anxiety that had been simmering beneath the surface now flooded his eyes, raw and unguarded. He didn't have to answer. The shock and recognition on his face were a confession. It was him, Ethan Cartwright. Not the billionaire from the magazines, the titan of industry. It was Ethan, the boy from St. Jude's Home for Boys and Girls, the boy who had been her friend, the boy who had made a promise in the heart of a fire, and then vanished from the face of the earth. Olivia, he breathed, his voice cracking. The coffee pot slammed onto the table with a loud clatter that made heads turn. Olivia took a step back, her chest tight, her mind reeling. The carefully ordered world of her diner section of her life had just been detonated. The ghost she had tried so hard to forget wasn't a ghost at all. He was sitting in her booth, drinking her coffee, looking at her as if he'd just seen a miracle. But Olivia didn't feel like a miracle. She felt like a wound that had just been torn open. "You," she said, her voice low and trembling, with a fury that had been dormant for 20 years. "What are you doing here?" The air in the narrow alley behind the diner was cold and damp, smelling of wet cardboard and grease. The rain had subsided to a miserable drizzle. Olivia stood with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her thin polo shirt offering little protection from the chill. Ethan stood a few feet away, looking lost and out of place amidst the overflowing dumpsters and stacked milk crates. The faded red brick of the alley wall seemed to absorb the silence between them. I've been looking for you." Olivia Ethan began, his voice strained. Olivia let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Looking for me? It took you 20 years. You own half the world, Ethan. You can find anyone, anything you want in a matter of hours. Don't lie to me. Not now." "It's not a lie," he insisted, taking a hesitant step forward. "It's complicated." "Complicated," she rounded on him, her eyes blazing with a pain he had never seen before. "Let me tell you what's not complicated. A promise. You remember, don't you, in the smoke with the sirens getting louder? You looked at me and my brother. You grabbed my hand and you promised." The memory was vivid, a scene seared into both their minds. St. Jude's, the underfunded, overcrowded youth home that had been their world. It wasn't perfect, but it was the only home they had. Ethan, the quiet, fiercely intelligent boy who had arrived a year before her. Olivia, the fiercely protective older sister. And Daniel, her bright, mischievous, 15-year-old brother, who looked up to Ethan like a hero. They were a strange, inseparable trio, bound by a shared sense of abandonment. Then came the fire. It started late one night in the old gymnasium building. A flicker, then a roar. Chaos, screams, the smell of terror. They had been trapped on the second floor. Ethan, always the quick thinker, had found a way out through a back maintenance stairwell, leading Olivia and Daniel through the smoke. That's when the burning rafter fell, the one that scarred his wrist and nearly took Daniel's head off. In that moment of pure terror, with the world collapsing around them, Ethan had made his vow. "We were separated," Ethan said, his voice pleading. "The paramedics took me to one hospital, you and Daniel to another. My foster parents, they were a wealthy couple who had just been assigned my case. They saw the fire on the news and they used it as an excuse. They pulled me out of the system that night. No goodbyes. No chance to find you. They moved me to a private facility, then to a new city. They told me the home was closed, the records were destroyed, that everyone was scattered. They said it was for the best. A clean break." "A clean break," Olivia's voice dripped with scorn. "Must be nice to just break away." "You were 17, Ethan." "I was 17. We weren't toddlers. You could have found us. You could have tried." "Did you even try? For years," he exclaimed, his frustration finally breaking through his calm demeanor. "I wrote letters that were never sent. I made calls my foster parents told me were impossible. By the time I was 18 and had my freedom, I went back. St. Jude's was gone, bulldozed. A shopping centre stood in its place. The county records were a bureaucratic nightmare. No one wanted to help a former ward of the state find his friends. And then, life happened. College work. I never stopped looking, not really, but the trail went cold. I had no last names, just Olivia and Daniel from St. Jude's." Olivia stared at him, her expression a mask of cold fury. "Our last name is Chen. It was always Chen. It was in the files. You just didn't look hard enough. Because you didn't want to. You got your golden ticket out of that life, and you never looked back. You left us behind." The truth was, a part of Ethan knew she was right. In the beginning, he had been powerless. But later, as he built his empire, as his influence grew, did he try hard enough? Or was he afraid of what he might find? Was he afraid that the ghosts of St. Jude's would tarnish the pristine image of Ethan Cartwright, the self-made billionaire? The guilt was a physical weight in his chest. "You left us to deal with the ashes," Olivia continued, her voice dropping to a raw, trembling whisper. "And they didn't just scatter us, Ethan. They needed someone to blame for the fire." A cold dread, far worse than anything he had felt waiting in that line, washed over Ethan. "What do you mean?" "An overloaded circuit," they said at first. "Faulty wiring in the old gym. But the county didn't want to pay. The private company that ran St. Jude's didn't want the liability, so they found a scapegoat." She looked him dead in the eye, and he saw a chasm of grief that stunned him into silence. A troubled kid with a history of acting out, a kid seen near the gym earlier that night. It was an easy story to sell. Ethan's mind raced, connecting the terrible dots. "No." "Yes," Olivia said, her voice breaking on the single word. "They blamed Daniel. They said he started it. My 15-year-old brother. They called him an arsonist." The weight of her words crushed the air from Ethan's lungs. This was the truth she had to reveal. It wasn't just about a broken promise between friends. It was about a life that had been systematically destroyed. The fire hadn't ended when the flames were extinguished. For Olivia and Daniel, it had just begun. And he, the boy who had promised to find them, had been living in a different world, completely oblivious to the real cost of that night. The drizzle intensified, plastering strands of Olivia's hair to her forehead. Ethan felt frozen, the cold rain seeping into his coat, doing little to numb the inferno of guilt raging within him. Daniel. Sweet, energetic Daniel, who could hot-wire a junked car, but was terrified of thunderstorms. The idea of him intentionally setting that fire was ludicrous and impossibility. That's a lie Ethan finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. Daniel would never. He was afraid of fire. He told me his first memory was a kitchen fire at a foster home when he was 3. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Olivia's cheek. Tell that to the juvenile justice system. Tell that to every foster family that rejected him after that. Tell that to the schools that treated him like a pariah. They ruined him, Ethan. They branded him. He could see it all now. The quiet, successful life he had built was a grand, opulent palace, built on a foundation of ignorance. While he was studying at Stanford, Daniel was being shuffled through the system. While he was coding the algorithm that would make him his first million, Daniel was fighting a label he could never escape. "Why couldn't you fight it?" He asked the question, sounding feeble and pathetic even to his own ears. Fight it with what Olivia shot back, her grief momentarily eclipsed by a fresh wave of anger. We were wards of the state. We had a court-appointed lawyer who met with us for 10 minutes. I was a minor. I screamed, I cried. I told them Daniel was with me with you when it started. They said I was just a sister, protecting her criminal brother. They didn't listen. Who would believe 2 throwaway kids over a county report? She was right. He knew the system. They were disposable. Their voices were whispers in a hurricane of bureaucracy and budget cuts. I came back here for a reason. Olivia Ethan said, his voice now low and steady, imbued with a resolve he hadn't felt before. This wasn't an accident. Me walking into your diner today. It wasn't chance. Olivia looked at him, suspicion clouding her features. The guilt of that night. It never left me. He confessed the words, feeling like shards of glass in his throat. It's been a shadow over everything I've ever built. The more successful I became, the larger the shadow grew. I tried to forget. I donated to charities, I funded orphanages, I built youth centers. All of it was penance. But it was empty, because it wasn't about helping kids. It was about quieting the memory of the 2 kids I left behind. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket. Tucked behind his driver's license was a small, creased and faded photograph. It was of the 3 of them, taken with a disposable camera a week before the fire. They were sitting on the roof of St. Jude's, grinning at the camera the city spread out behind them. Daniel had his arm slung over Ethan's shoulders. Olivia was leaning against her brother, her smile wide and genuine. They looked for all the world like a family. "I've carried this for 20 years, he said, holding it out to her. "A year ago, I decided I couldn't live with the ghost anymore. I hired the best private investigators in the country. Not to find Olivia and Daniel from St. Jude's, but to find Olivia and Daniel Chen. I finally used my resources. My money, everything I should have used 2 decades ago." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but a crack in the wall of her fury. The trail was cold, convoluted. The system is designed to make people disappear. But they found whispers. A girl named Olivia Chen, who had worked her way up and down the West Coast, always in diners, always keeping to herself. The trail led them to Portland. 2 months ago, they narrowed it down to this neighborhood. They told me there was a waitress named Olivia at a place called the Corner Spoon. I didn't want to send a lawyer or an investigator. I didn't want to scare you. I had to come myself. I've been in this city for a week, Olivia. I've been working up the courage to walk through that door all morning. He had been hunting a ghost, but he was the one who was haunted. He wasn't a monster who had forgotten. He was a coward who had waited too long to face his past. "So you know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't forget. I was just too late. Olivia stared at the photograph, then back at his face. The story was incredible, but the look in his eyes, the raw pain that mirrored her own, was undeniable. He had been looking for her. The thought was a disorienting mix of comfort and agony. He hadn't abandoned them in his heart, but in practice the result was the same. Too late, she repeated, her voice hollow. You have no idea what too late means, Ethan. Ethan braced himself. He could see a new storm gathering in Olivia's eyes, a darkness that went beyond the injustice done to her brother. The first truth had been a revelation of institutional failure and broken promises. He sensed that the second truth, the one she had been holding back, was a personal apocalypse. Where is he? Olivia Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Where is Daniel? I need to see him. I need to apologize. I can help him. I have lawyers' resources. We can clear his name. I can give him a new life. The words meant to be a balm, a promise of a rectified future, seemed to land like blows. Olivia flinched, and the fragile crack in her armor sealed over, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. You can't help him, she said flatly. The rain began to fall harder, drumming a somber rhythm on the dumpster lids around them. No one can. Don't say that, Ethan pleaded, stepping closer. Money can't solve everything, I know that. But it can open doors. It can hire the people who can fix this. We can get the records unsealed, find the fire marshal's original report. Stop, Olivia interrupted, her voice sharp and final. She held up a hand, and he fell silent. You still don't get it. You live in a world where everything can be fixed, bought, or solved, but some things are just broken. Permanently. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind one takes before diving into icy water. The label arsonist followed Daniel everywhere. He couldn't stay in a foster home for more than a few months. He was kicked out of 3 different high schools. He started getting into real trouble because when people treat you like a criminal for long enough, you start to believe it. He fell in with the wrong crowd. Small things at first, shoplifting, vandalism. Then it got worse. Joyriding, breaking, and entering. She was looking past Ethan, her eyes focused on a point in the distant grey sky, as if replaying a film only she could see. I tried to help him. When I turned 18, I got us a tiny apartment. I worked 2 jobs to support us. I begged him to go back to school to get his GED. For a while it worked. He got a job as a mechanic's apprentice. He was good with his hands, just like he always was. He was starting to smile again. Ethan felt a fragile flicker of hope. So what happened? He had it on his record. The juvenile arson charge. The garage owner did a background check 6 months in and fired him. Said his insurance wouldn't cover an arsonist. That broke him, Ethan. It was the last time I saw the light go out in his eyes. He said the world would never let him forget. So why should he bother trying to be something else? The alley felt smaller, the walls closing in. Ethan could feel the narrative turning, heading towards a conclusion he was desperate not to hear. He started using drugs. First pills, then heroin. He was chasing away the ghosts, but they always came back. He was in and out of jail, then prison. Every time he got out, I was there. I'd get him into a new program, a new apartment, and every time something would pull him back under. The world is not a forgiving place for a boy like Daniel. She finally lowered her gaze, meeting his. Her eyes were devoid of tears, now filled with an emptiness that was far more terrifying. I got a call 6 weeks ago, from the Multnomah County Coroner's Office. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against Ethan's soul. No. 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 It was an overdose, Olivia said, her voice clinical, as if detaching herself from the reality of the statement. Accidental, they said. He was found in a boarding house downtown, alone. He was 35 years old, the world tilted on its axis. Ethan reached out, placing a hand against the cold, wet brick of the alley wall to steady himself. Daniel was dead. The bright, laughing boy from the photograph, the kid who had looked at him with such hero worship, was gone. He hadn't just been wronged, he had been consumed. The fire at St. Jude's hadn't just scarred them. It had been a slow-burning fuse that had finally, 20 years later, claimed its last victim. Ethan's promise hadn't just been broken. It had been rendered utterly, horrifyingly meaningless. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't apologize. He couldn't give Daniel a new life. He was in every sense of the word too late. The weight of this second truth was absolute. It was the full stop at the end of a tragic story. His billions were worthless. His power was a mockery. All the penance, all the charitable donations. It was all just blood money paid to a ghost while the real victim had been suffering and dying a slow death. "I'm sorry," he whispered the words utterly inadequate, pathetic. "Olivia, I am so sorry." Olivia just shook her head, a bitter final motion. "Sorry doesn't bring him back, Ethan. Sorry doesn't give him back the 20 years they stole from him. You wanted to find us. Well, you found me. This is what's left." She turned and walked back towards the diner's rear entrance, her shoulders slumped, leaving Ethan Cartwright, the titan of industry, alone in the rain, with the wreckage of 2 lives on his conscience. For 2 days, Ethan Cartwright did not leave his suite at the Nines Hotel. He cancelled his meetings, ignored the frantic calls from his board of directors, and shut out the world. He sat in the silence, the view of the city's twinkling lights, a bitter irony. He had built an empire on logic, on seeing patterns and solving complex problems. But the problem of Daniel Chen had no solution. It was a debt that could never be repaid. Grief and guilt were a paralyzing cocktail. He could sell his company, give every last cent to Olivia, and it would change nothing. It would be an insult, an attempt to put a price on a life that had been systematically dismantled. The boy in the photograph deserved more than that. He deserved more than apologies and hollow gestures. He deserved justice. On the 3rd morning, something shifted. The paralysis gave way to a cold, hard resolve. He couldn't bring Daniel back, but he could sure as hell burn down the system that had let him die. He could give him back the one thing they had stolen from him, his name. Ethan picked up his phone. His first call was not to his COO or his wealth manager. It was to Joanna Finch. Finch was a legend, a semi-retired corporate litigator known as the Shark. She was ruthless, brilliant, and terrifyingly expensive. She had a reputation for taking on impossible cases for the thrill of the fight. "Joanna, it's Ethan Cartwright. I have a job for you. I'm not calling about Helios. This is personal." He laid out the entire story from the night of the fire at St. Jude's to the conversation in the alley with Olivia. He didn't spare himself detailing his own negligence and delay. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This isn't a lawsuit, Ethan. This is an archaeological dig," Finch said, her voice raspy and sharp. "The records are sealed, the witnesses are scattered, and the key victim is deceased. What's the win here?" "The truth," Ethan said simply. "I want Daniel Chen's name cleared. I want it on the public record that he was not an arsonist. And I want to find the person or entity responsible for that fire and the subsequent cover-up, and I want to hold them accountable. Whatever it takes, there is no budget." Another pause. "All right, Ethan, you have my attention. I'll be in Portland tomorrow. Wire the retainer and have your investigators send me everything they have. And I mean everything." The moment he hung up, Ethan became the architect of a new kind of enterprise, not for profit, but for restitution. He turned the full force of his intellect and resources, the very tools that had built his fortune, towards dismantling a 20-year-old lie. He retasked his private investigation firm, a team of former federal agents and intelligence analysts. Their new mission: find every person who was at St. Jude's that night, staff, children, firefighters, police. Find the original fire marshal, Walter Galloway, who had signed the initial report. Find the executives of Viridian Group, the private management company that ran St. Jude's. Within a week, Finch had assembled a legal team in a rented office space downtown. The conference room walls were covered in whiteboards, mapping out timelines, names, and connections. It looked like a war room, and in a way it was. The first breakthrough came from the investigators. Walter Galloway, the fire marshal, was now 78 and living in a retirement community in Arizona. He was bitter and guilt-ridden. When approached by Finch's team, he folded almost immediately. He told them his initial report had concluded the fire was electrical, caused by ancient, faulty wiring in the gymnasium. He said he was pressured by a county supervisor, who was in turn being pressured by Viridian Group to amend the report. Viridian's insurance wouldn't cover negligence, but they could avoid liability if a perpetrator was found. So they found one Daniel Chen. Galloway, a man with a mortgage and a kid in college, had caved. He produced a copy of his original buried report. It was the first pillar of their case. The second breakthrough was bigger. Ethan's tech team, a group of elite cybersecurity experts he normally used for corporate espionage defense, were put on a different task. He had them legally acquire and analyze every byte of data from Viridian Group's 20-year-old servers. After days of forensic data recovery, they found it a chain of internal emails. The emails between Viridian's then CEO, a man named Albert Monroe, and their legal counsel explicitly discussed the need to mitigate financial exposure from the St. Jude's fire by identifying a suitable scapegoat from the home's population of at-risk youth. One email contained the sickening line, "Find the one with the worst record. Make it stick." It was the smoking gun. A cold, calculated corporate decision to sacrifice a child to protect their bottom line. Ethan didn't tell Olivia about any of this. He didn't want to give her false hope. He simply went back to the diner a week after their encounter in the alley. He sat in the same booth. When she approached her face, a mask of weary professionalism, he just slid a simple envelope across the table. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cold. "It's a paycheck," he said. "For the next year. You don't have to take it. But I want you to have the choice to walk away from this job, to have time to breathe. There are no strings attached." He stood up. "I am working on something, Olivia. Something for Daniel. I can't make any promises yet. But I am not going to let this go." He left before she could respond. Olivia opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for an amount that made her sit down heavily in the booth opposite where he had been. It wasn't a solution, but it was, as he said, a choice. It was the first time in her adult life she had one. 3 months later, Olivia stood in the back of a crowded press conference at the Portland City Hall. She wore a simple black dress purchased with the money Ethan had given her. She felt like an imposter, surrounded by sharp-suited reporters and television cameras. At the podium stood Joanna Finch, flanked by a stone-faced Ethan Cartwright. Finch, with the precision of a surgeon, laid out the case. She presented the original fire marshal's report. She read the damning emails from Viridian Group. She detailed without emotion the 20-year trajectory of Daniel Chen's life, linking every failure, every incarceration, back to the single fabricated charge that had defined him. The room was silent, save for the furious clicking of cameras. As of this morning, Finch announced, her voice ringing with authority, the state of Oregon has officially exonerated Daniel Chen of all charges related to the St. Jude's fire of 2005. His record has been posthumously expunged. Furthermore, the district attorney's office has opened a criminal investigation into Viridian Group and its former executives for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. A gasp went through the room. Olivia felt her knees go weak. She reached out, steadying herself on the back of a chair. Expunged. Exonerated. The words were a balm on a wound she had carried for 2 decades. They weren't magic. They didn't bring him back. But they were the truth. Her brother was not a criminal. He was a victim. And now the whole world knew it. After the press conference, Ethan found her in the hallway. The usual confidence he projected in public was gone. He looked tired, but the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "It's not enough," he said softly. "I know that. But it's a start." "Thank you, Ethan," Olivia said, and for the first time the words were genuine, free from the bitterness that had coated their every interaction. You gave him back his name. A week later they stood together on a vacant, overgrown lot, the very ground where St. Jude's Home for Boys and Girls had once stood. A large sign was planted in the dirt, a rendering of a beautiful modern building. The sign read, "Coming soon. The Daniel Chen Center for Youth Advocacy and Opportunity." "I'm liquidating a significant portion of my Helios shares," Ethan explained, his eyes on the sign. "I'm creating a foundation. This will be its first project. A place for kids aging out of the foster system. It will provide housing, legal aid, job training, mental health services. Everything you and Daniel should have had." He turned to her. "I don't want to just fund it. I want to build it. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands. Someone who knows what these kids really need. I want you to run it, Olivia. Not as an employee, as my partner, director of the foundation. We can build a legacy for him, not a memory of tragedy, but a future of hope for thousands of kids just like him." Olivia looked from the sign with her brother's name written in bold, hopeful letters to Ethan's face. She saw the boy from the rooftop, the one who made promises. He had broken one catastrophically. But here he was, 20 years later, trying to make a new one. A better one. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long, long time, they weren't tears of grief or anger. They were tears of a fragile, nascent hope. The past couldn't be changed. The ghost of her brother would always be with her. But here on this haunted ground, they had a chance to build something new from the ashes. A second chance, not just for the kids who would walk through the center's doors, but for the 2 survivors standing in front of it. "Okay, Ethan," she said, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "Okay. Let's get to work." 1 year later, the perpetual Oregon rain had given way to a brilliant, crisp autumn morning. The air was filled not with the smell of coffee and grease, but with the scent of fresh-cut lumber and damp earth. On the very lot where the ruins of St. Jude's had been bulldozed into memory, a new skeleton of steel and concrete was rising towards the sky. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Daniel Chen Center was over. The politicians and reporters had departed, leaving behind a field of empty folding chairs and the quiet hum of a promising future. Ethan stood beside Olivia, his hands shoved into the pockets of a tailored suit that felt more like a costume than clothing. He had given hundreds of speeches in his career, launching products and placating shareholders, but the few words he'd spoken an hour ago had left his throat dry and his heart pounding. This felt different. This felt real. Olivia, by contrast, seemed to have grown into her new role as if it were a second skin. She had traded her faded waitress uniform for a professional but understated navy blue dress. She had captivated the audience, not with corporate polish, but with raw, unvarnished truth. When a cynical reporter had asked if the project was merely guilt money, Olivia had stepped to the podium. "Guilt is an engine," she had said, her voice steady and clear, silencing the crowd. "It can drive you into the ground, or it can drive you to build something better. We are not here to erase the past. We are here to honor a victim of it by ensuring it never happens again. Every dollar in this foundation is a promise to a child in this city that their name matters, that their story will be heard, and that they will never ever be treated as a line item on a balance sheet." Now, in the quiet aftermath, she stared at the bustling construction site, a faint, proud smile on her face. "You've found your voice," Ethan said, his tone a mix of admiration and awe. "I always had it," she replied, turning to him. "I just never had a microphone." There's a difference. Their partnership over the past year had been a delicate, challenging dance. They were two people from different universes, bound by a shared ghost. Their board meetings were a clash of cultures. Ethan would talk about budget's efficiency and scalable solutions. Olivia would talk about trauma trust and the need for a non-judgmental space. She vetoed his idea for biometric security scanners at the entrance, insisting on a welcoming open-door policy. He, in turn, tempered her desire to help every single person with the logistical realities of building a sustainable organization. They argued, they compromised, and in the process, they forged a powerful, effective alliance. "I was reviewing the final blueprints with the architect this morning," Ethan said, changing the subject. "The West Wing, the residential floor. I have a question about your budget allocation for the furnishings. It's 30% higher per unit than the industry standard for this type of facility." Olivia didn't flinch. "I know, I specified it. It's not efficient, Olivia. We could house more kids if we cut back on those amenities. And what's the first thing those kids will think when they walk into a room with a cheap bed and a particle board desk?" She countered, her gaze intense. "They'll think, this is all I'm worth." They have been told that their entire lives by every institution they've ever known. For once, I want them to walk into a space that feels like a home, a space that tells them they are valuable, that they deserve comfort, that they deserve something beautiful. What's the ROI on a teenager's self-worth? Ethan was silent for a moment, looking at the rising structure. He saw not steel beams and concrete, but the ghosts of 1,000 lonely nights in sterile, uncaring rooms. He saw his own past and Daniel's. "You're right," he said, finally, his voice quiet. "You're absolutely right. Approve the budget." A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched a crane lift a massive steel beam into place. The piece swung suspended against the brilliant blue sky before being expertly guided into its position, where workers swarmed to bolt it down. It was a single piece of a massive, complex puzzle. "Does it ever get easier?" Olivia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thinking about him, Ethan knew who she meant. Daniel was the third silent partner in their enterprise. His memory was in every blueprint, every budget meeting, every decision they made. "No," Ethan answered honestly. "It doesn't get easier. The weight is still there, but it feels different now. It used to be the weight of an anchor pulling me down. Now it feels like the weight of a foundation, something to build on." He looked at her, at the woman who had faced him with such fury in a rainy alley. The anger in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective determination. He realized that in his quest to atone for the past, he had stumbled into the most meaningful work of his life. He wasn't just building a center, he was helping to rebuild a person, and in doing so, was rebuilding himself. Olivia nodded, accepting his answer. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small framed photo. It was the same one from his wallet, the three of them, on the roof of St. Jude's, young and smiling, immortalized in a moment before the fire. She walked over to the concrete foundation wall and gently placed the photo at its base, leaning it against the cool grey surface. "For him," she said softly. "So he knows we're finally home." They stood there for a long time, two survivors no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they were determined to build together. The sun warmed their faces, and the sounds of construction, of drilling, hammering, and creation filled the air. It was the sound of a broken promise being forged into a new, unbreakable one. The story of Ethan and Olivia isn't just about a billionaire and a waitress. It's a powerful reminder that our past is never truly gone. It walks with us in the scars we carry and the promises we break. It shows us that wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in integrity, and that true power lies not in what you can buy, but in what you can mend. Daniel Chen's life was a tragedy born from a lie, but his legacy, built from the truth, will now save others. It's a testament to the idea that it is never too late to fight for what is right, to right a wrong, and to turn a legacy of pain into a beacon of hope. If this story of hidden truths, profound loss, and ultimate redemption resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to help us share more stories like this. Click subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And we want to hear from you what part of Ethan and Olivia's journey moved you the most. Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.